27 nannies in 6 months, 27 contracts torn to shreds, 27 times Alessandro Romano, the ice king of the Mediterranean, had tried to find someone to care for his silent, traumatized daughter, Sofia. And 27 times, he caught them on camera stealing, sleeping, or treating his child like a paycheck. So, he built a fortress. He installed a grid of high-definition lenses that tracked every heartbeat and every shadow in the nursery from his bulletproof surveillance suite. Then, the new girl walked in, a waitress from the docks. Cheap shoes, tired eyes, and skin that glowed like mahogany against the cold marble of his estate. She checked Sofia's pulse, brushed the hair from the girl's face, and then she did something that made every armed guard in the room draw their breath. She picked up the $10,000 nutritional meal prepared by Alessandro's private chef, took one sniff, and without a second thought, scraped the whole thing into the trash can. His head of security reached for his weapon. Alessandro raised a hand, his eyes narrowed. "Wait!" Nia turned her head. She didn't look past the hidden camera, she looked at it, like she was staring directly into Alessandro's soul through the glass. Her voice was a low, melodic blade. "Mr. Romano, this house is a tomb. You're feeding her poison and calling it protection. You can come down here and put me on the street like the others, or you can give me one night to prove that I'm the only person in this fortress not trying to kill her." Alessandro was through the door in 30 seconds. He stood in the nursery, a predator ready to strike. But Nia didn't flinch. She was kneeling on the floor, Sofia's small face tucked into her neck, the girl's hands finally unclenched for the first time in a year. Nia looked up, completely unbothered by the man who terrified empires. "Are you going to keep playing God with your cameras, Alessandro, or are you going to help me save your daughter?" Do you think Nia just invited her own execution, or did she just give the most dangerous man in Italy the only thing he didn't know he needed? Drop your answer in the comments. Courage or crazy? Subscribe right now to see the moment Alessandro realizes the threat isn't the waitress. It's the men standing right behind him. Let us know where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story is traveling. Let's go. The gates of the marble fortress didn't just open. They retreated, heavy iron groaning against stone as if protesting Nia's arrival. The estate earned its name. It sat perched on the cliffs like bleached bone, beautiful and terrifyingly desolate. As Nia stepped into the grand foyer, the air changed. It was thin, smelling of expensive wax and the sharp, metallic tang of the nearby sea. "Stand still," a voice commanded, slicing through the silence. Nia froze. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Alessandro. His presence was a physical weight in the room, a cold front that moved before him. She stared at a vein of gray quartz in the floor, her pulse drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt his gaze like a scalpel, peeling back her composure to see what lay beneath the uniform she had been instructed to wear. It wasn't the gaze of a master looking at a servant. It was the look of an architect inspecting a flaw in the foundation. "The agency said you were resilient," he said, his footsteps slow and rhythmic on the marble. He circled her, the soft scuff of his leather shoes echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "They said you don't break easily. In this house, resilience is the only currency I value." Nia forced herself to breathe, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. "I'm here to work, Mr. Morty, not to be analyzed." A brief, sharp silence followed. She felt him stop directly behind her. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from him was a stark contrast to the glacial atmosphere of the fortress. She could feel his eyes tracing the line of her shoulders, knotting the tension she couldn't quite hide. It was an analytical scrutiny that felt disturbingly intimate, as if he were memorizing the exact frequency of her fear. "You'll find that in this house, Nia, everything is an analysis," he whispered, his voice a low vibration. "The way you hold your breath, the way you refuse to look at me, it all tells a story. I suggest you start learning mine if you plan to survive the season." He walked away without another word, the click of his office door signaling her release. Nia finally let out her breath, her knees trembling. The marble fortress was a cage of exquisite design, and Alessandro was its most dangerous inhabitant. She was here for her service, but as she looked at the towering walls around her, she realized the service he required might cost more than she had to give. The salt air of the coast felt like a suffocating shroud as Nia walked away from the cliffs, the shadow of the marble fortress finally receding behind her. By the time she reached the cramped, leaning cottage on the edge of the village, her hands were still numb. She pushed through the door, the familiar scent of dried herbs and wood smoke failing to provide its usual comfort. In the corner, huddled beneath a moth-eaten shawl, her grandmother sat in a high-backed chair. Alina looked smaller than she had this morning, her skin like translucent parchment. At the sound of the latch, the old woman's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a frantic, milky light. "Did you go?" Alina's voice was a dry rattle. "Nia, did you enter that house?" "I did, Nana," Nia murmured, kneeling at her feet. She took the older woman's hands. They were cold and trembling violently, a rhythmic shudder that seemed to come from the bone. "Alessandro Romano has accepted my service. I start tomorrow." Alina let out a choked sound, half sob and half gasp, her fingers clutching Nia's wrists with surprising strength. "You don't understand the depth of it. Your father." He thought he could outrun men like that. He thought silence was a shield, but the Romanos never forget a ledger. Nia felt a cold bead of sweat track down her spine. The agency said it was a simple placement, a way to settle the family's arrears. But Alessandro looked at me as if he already owned the soul inside my body. "He does," Alina whispered, leaning in until Nia could see the sheer terror etched into the wrinkles of her face. "It isn't just money, Nia. Years ago, your father took something from the Romano vaults, something that wasn't gold. He traded your future to keep us alive when the syndicate came for blood. Alessandro isn't looking for a maid. He's looking for the restitution he was promised when he was just a boy." The realization hit Nia with the force of a physical blow. The cold, analytical stare she had endured at the fortress wasn't curiosity. It was a collector checking the quality of his collateral. She wasn't an employee. She was a forfeit. "I have to go back," Nia said, the words tasting like ash. "If I don't, what happens to you?" Alina didn't answer. She only looked toward the window, where the lights of the marble fortress flickered on the horizon like a predator's eyes. Nia realized then that her service was a cage built long before she was old enough to know its name. She would endure Alessandro's terrors because the alternative was a darkness that would swallow her grandmother whole. The monitors in Alessandro's private study cast a ghostly blue light across his features, sharpening the hard angles of his jaw. He sat in the dark, a glass of amber liquid untouched on the desk, his eyes fixed on the feed from the nursery. He watched Nia. She moved with a quiet, efficient grace that should have been invisible, yet he found himself tracking the rhythmic sway of her shadow against the subway-tiled walls. He was looking for a slip, a silver spoon tucked into a pocket, a lingering look at the keypad, a hidden wire. He knew the history of her bloodline better than she did. He expected a thief. But then Nia stopped. On the counter sat a small porcelain bowl of pureed squash and poached chicken, prepared for Sophia, Alessandro's young daughter. Sophia was a delicate, silent child who often pushed her plate away with a look of profound distrust. Alessandro watched as Nia glanced toward the hallway, her posture taut. When she was certain she was alone, she didn't reach for the silverware or the expensive spices. Instead, she took a tiny, wooden tasting spoon from her apron. She dipped it into the child's bowl, taking a minuscule portion. Alessandro leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He expected her to poison it or perhaps to indulge in a luxury she couldn't afford. But she didn't swallow immediately. She held the food in her mouth, her expression focused and distant. She closed her eyes, her brow furrowing in deep concentration. She wasn't eating, she was testing. She was checking the temperature, the texture, and the salt, testing it not for quality, but for comfort. She added a single drop of honey from a jar and stirred it in with a tenderness that looked like a glitch in the cold machinery of his house. She touched the side of the bowl with the back of her hand, ensuring it wouldn't burn a sensitive tongue, her face softening into a look of maternal sorrow that made Alessandro's chest tighten with an unidentified friction. She was protecting the one thing in this fortress he hadn't told her to guard. Alessandro stood, the ice in his glass clinking, a sharp, lonely sound in the silent room. He had brought her here to be a pawn, a living debt to be collected, but she was operating outside the logic of his world. She wasn't a predator and she wasn't a victim. She was a variable he hadn't accounted for. He watched her tray up the meal and head toward the nursery, his thumb tracing the rim of his glass. "What are you playing at, Nia?" he whispered to the empty room. He realized then that the most dangerous thing in the marble fortress wasn't his cruelty, but her empathy. It was a flaw in the system he had built, and for the first time in years, Alessandro felt the unsettling urge to step out from behind the glass. The following afternoon, the fortress felt less like a home and more like a pressure cooker. Alessandro had disappeared into the lower levels, leaving the air thick with the residue of his cold authority. Nia was polishing the heavy silver in the dining room when the side door swung open, admitting a man who carried himself with a jagged, nervous energy that Alessandro lacked. This was Lorenzo, a man Nia recognized from the whispered warnings of the village, a high-ranking lieutenant with a smile that never reached his eyes. He didn't wait for an invitation. He leaned against the mahogany table, his shadow stretching long across the polished surface. "A lot of weight for such small shoulders," Lorenzo said, his voice a slick caress. He tapped a heavy gold ring against a silver platter. "The debt of a dead father, the life of a dying grandmother. It's a heavy price for a girl who doesn't belong in a tomb like this." Nia didn't look up, her cloth moving in steady, rhythmic circles. "I'm here to work, senor. My shoulders are stronger than they look." Lorenzo chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering over pavement. He stepped closer, invading her space until she could smell his sharp cologne and expensive tobacco. "Alessandro is a machine. He sees you as a decimal point on a balance sheet. He'll use you until there's nothing left, then discard you like the rest of the debris your father left behind." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a small, unmarked USB drive, sliding it across the table toward her hand. "One night. That's all it takes. Plug this into the terminal in his study while he's distracted with the child. By morning, your debt is erased. I'll have a car waiting to take you and your grandmother across the border. No more marble, no more ghosts." Nia's hand faltered. The lure of freedom was a physical pull, a vision of the sun on her face without the shadow of the fortress looming over her. She looked at the drive, then up at Lorenzo. His smile was wide now, the smile of a predator watching a bird hop toward a trap. "Why help me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Let's just say I prefer a world where debts are settled quickly," Lorenzo replied, his eyes gleaming with a hungry ambition. "Think about the old woman, Nia. She doesn't have another winter in her. This is your only way out." He turned and walked away, leaving the drive sitting on the table like a poisoned seed. Nia stared at it, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought of Alessandro's analytical eyes and then of the way she had sweetened Sophia's food. To take the deal was to save herself, but it was also to hand the keys of the fortress to a man who would surely burn it down with the child still inside. The laundry room was the only corner of the marble fortress that felt honest, a place of steam, soap, and the rhythmic thrum of industrial machines. But as Nia moved to clear a forgotten pile of linens in the back corner, her foot snagged on a loose floorboard. Beneath it sat a manila envelope, hidden away from the prying eyes of the high-definition cameras that governed the rest of the house. Her breath hitched as she slid the contents onto a folding table. It wasn't money or jewelry. It was a dossier of nightmares. Pinned to the top were grainy, long-range telephoto images of Sophia. These weren't the clinical, protective feeds Alessandro monitored. These were predatory. Sophia playing on the terrace, Sophia through the nursery window, Sophia sleeping, each photo marked with red ink detailing the exact time of the guards' shift changes. Beneath the photos lay a set of architectural blueprints for the nursery wing, with a heavy red X marking the service elevator Nia used every morning. The realization hit her like a plunge into the icy Mediterranean. Lorenzo's bribe wasn't about bank codes or business secrets. The USB drive he had offered her was a key to bypass the final layer of Sophia's security. They weren't just planning to rob Alessandro, they were planning to rip the heart out of the fortress. 4 minutes, Nia whispered, her eyes scanning a handwritten note attached to the blueprints. The note detailed a coordinated outage scheduled for the following night. A window of 4 minutes where the electronic locks would fail and the backup generators would be delayed. In that window, Sophia wouldn't be a Romano heiress, she would be a commodity. Nia's hands shook so violently the papers rattled. She looked at the door, half expecting Lorenzo to be standing there with that jagged, predator's smile. She had come to this house as a prisoner of a debt, viewing Alessandro as her primary tormentor. But looking at these photos, she realized the Ice King was blind to the vipers nesting in his own shadow. She thought of the way Sophia had finally leaned into her during their afternoon reading, a tiny thaw in a frozen world. If Nia stayed silent, she could take Lorenzo's money and run, leaving the Romano bloodline to destroy itself. But as she stared at the red X over the child's bed, she knew she couldn't walk away. She wasn't just a waitress or a debtor anymore. She was the only person who knew the exact moment the fortress would fall. The air in the laundry room felt thin, vibrating with the secret she now held in her hands. Nia knew the geography of the fortress's surveillance better than she let on. She knew exactly where the blind spots ended and the dragon's eyes began. She gathered the blueprints and the predatory photos, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. To keep them hidden was to be a silent accomplice. To show them was to step into the line of fire. She walked out into the hallway, moving with a deliberate slowness that felt like walking through deep water. She stopped directly beneath the recessed dome of a high-definition camera, the small red light blinking like a pulse. She didn't look down. She didn't look away. Nia raised her head and stared directly into the lens. She knew Alessandro was there, sitting in the blue-lit silence of his study, dissecting her every twitch. With a steady hand, she fanned the photos of Sophia, the ones with the red ink and the predatory timestamps, out across her chest. She held them there for a long, agonizing beat, ensuring the resolution was high enough for him to see the betrayal etched in ink. Then, she did the unthinkable. She reached into her pocket and pulled out Lorenzo's USB drive, holding it up between two fingers like a captured insect. Her gaze remained locked on the camera, fierce and unwavering. She didn't speak a word, but her message was a silent roar. They are coming for her, and they think I am helping them. In a final, defiant gesture, she dropped the drive onto the marble floor and crushed it beneath the heel of her shoe. The plastic snapped, a small, sharp sound that echoed through the empty corridor. She pointed one finger toward the nursery and then made a slicing motion across her own throat. She was choosing a side. She was betting her life that Alessandro's love for his daughter was stronger than his hatred for her father's blood. She was inviting the monster into her confidence to keep the vipers away from the child. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the threat of a violent response. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the electronic lock on the nearby security door cycled with a heavy metallic thud. The dragon had seen. The game of observation was over, and as Nia stood her ground, she realized she had just turned the marble fortress into a battlefield. The silence of the marble fortress didn't break, it shattered. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the low hum of the climate control vanished, swallowed by a sudden, suffocating void. A heartbeat later, the bleached stone corridors were plunged into ink-black darkness before the emergency red lights flickered to life, casting rhythmic, bloody pulses against the walls. In the command center, Alessandro slammed his hands onto the console. His screens were screaming. Not with the high-definition clarity he prided himself on, but with a chaotic, shifting snow of static and betrayal. He watched in visceral horror as the men he had trusted, men who had sworn blood oaths to the Romano name, began to move with the practiced precision of ghosts. They weren't defending the perimeter, they were systematically clearing it. "Lorenzo!" Alessandro hissed, the name tasting like ash. He watched the final working feed, a flickering window into Sophia's nursery. The door, reinforced with titanium and supposed to be impenetrable, groaned open. A man stepped in, the red emergency strobe glinting off the matte black barrel of a suppressed pistol. It was Marco, the head of his personal detail, a man who had carried Sophia as an infant. He didn't hesitate. He leveled the weapon at the small, trembling shape huddled in the center of the bed. Alessandro let out a roar of primal, helpless fury, his fingers clawing at the glass of the monitor. He was trapped. The coordinated outage Nia had warned him about had locked the command center from the outside. He was the king of a mountain he could no longer reach, forced to witness the end of his legacy through a lens. But then, a shadow moved in the corner of the nursery. Nia stepped out from behind the heavy velvet drapes. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't have the cold, calculated training of the men in the halls. She looked small, her white uniform stark against the red pulses of light, her face a mask of raw, unadulterated terror. Yet, as Marco stepped forward, she didn't run. She didn't plead for her life. She threw herself across the bed, her body a living shield, her arms locking around Sophia with a ferocity that defied the logic of the fortress. She looked directly into the camera one last time, her eyes luminous and wide, a silent command for Alessandro to move. Alessandro didn't wait for the generators. He drew his weapon and slammed it into the reinforced glass of his own office, the shards cutting his hands as he prepared to tear his way through his own home to reach the woman who was doing what he could not. The crack of the gunshot was a sickening, muffled pop that swallowed the air in the nursery. Nia felt a sudden, searing heat tear through the meat of her shoulder, a white-hot iron brand that knocked the breath from her lungs. The force spun her backward, but she didn't fall. She collapsed onto the bed, her body a living cloak draped over Sophia. The child's silent scream was a vibration against Nia's chest, a heartbeat that wasn't her own. Marco leveled the gun again, his face a mask of cold frustration. "Stubborn bitch!" he spat, stepping closer to finish what he'd started, before he could pull the trigger. The nursery door didn't just open, it exploded off its hinges. Alessandro charged through the debris like a force of nature, his silhouette jagged and terrifying in the pulsing red light. He didn't shout, he didn't give a command. He fired twice with a precision that was purely mechanical, two sharp reports that silenced Marco forever. The room fell into a ringing, hollow quiet. Alessandro ignored the fallen traitor. He moved toward the bed, his movements frantic, stripping away the calculated grace he had worn like armor. He saw the dark stain spreading across Nia's shoulder, the crimson blooming fast against the white of her uniform. "Nia!" he choked out, the name sounding foreign and fragile in his mouth. She looked up, her vision blurring at the edges, her face the color of the marble cliffs outside. Her hand was still clamped firmly over Sophia's eyes, shielding the child from the carnage. "Is she?" Nia's voice trailed off, a ragged whisper. "Is she safe?" "She's safe," Alessandro said, his hands shaking as he reached for her. For the first time, his touch wasn't analytical. It was desperate. He gathered her into his arms, pulling her away from the bed with a tenderness that seemed to physically pain him. He pressed his hand against her wound, his expensive suit jacket quickly soaking through with her blood. Nia let out a soft, broken whimper, her head falling back against his shoulder, but even as her strength failed, her other hand remained locked in Sophia's nightgown. She refused to let go, her protective instinct overriding the shock of the lead in her bone. "Hush!" Alessandro commanded, but the iron was gone from his voice, replaced by a raw, bleeding vulnerability. He tucked her head into the hollow of his neck, his heartbeat thundering against her ear. "There is no debt, Nia. Do you hear me? There is no debt." He stood, lifting her effortlessly, his eyes fixed on her fatting gaze. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, but as he carried the woman who had bled for his bloodline toward the medical wing, he realized the walls had finally crumbled. He wasn't saving a servant. He was fighting to keep the only light in the marble fortress from going out. The recovery wing was a sanctuary of hushed tones and the rhythmic hum of high-end monitors, a far cry from the violent strobe of the nursery. When Nia finally opened her eyes, the first thing she felt wasn't the dull ache in her shoulder, but the warmth of a hand holding hers. She looked over to see Alina, her grandmother, tucked into a plush armchair that cost more than their cottage. The old woman wasn't trembling. She was asleep, her face peaceful, draped in a blanket of the finest cashmere. "She's been well cared for," a voice murmured from the shadows. Alessandro sat by the window, the morning sun catching the sharp edges of his silhouette. He looked tired, the predatory edge of his gaze softened by a heavy, contemplative exhaustion. He rose and walked toward the bed, but he didn't stop at the foot of it. He sat on the edge of the mattress, his presence no longer a threat but a grounded weight. "The cottage has been sold," he said, his voice a low vibration. "I've purchased the estate adjacent to the cliffs for her. She will have her own staff, her own doctors. She will never want for anything again, Nia. That was the first thing I settled." Nia tried to sit up, but the world tilted. Alessandro's hand moved instinctively to her shoulder, steadying her with a gentleness that felt like a confession. "And my service," she whispered. "The debt my father left." Alessandro reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy velvet box. He didn't offer her a ring, but a key, gold, intricate and etched with the Romano seal. It wasn't the key to a servant's entrance. "The service is over," he said firmly. "The girl who walked into this fortress to pay for the sins of the past died in that nursery. The woman who stood in front of a bullet for my daughter. She is someone else entirely." He stood and walked to the wardrobe, pulling out a garment that was a sharp departure from the stiff gray cotton of her uniform. It was a suit of deep charcoal silk, tailored and commanding. He laid it across the foot of the bed. "Lorenzo is gone. My inner circle is being rebuilt from the ashes," Alessandro said, turning back to her. His eyes, once cold and analytical, now held a burning, singular focus. "I don't need someone to polish my silver, Nia. I need someone who can see the shadows I miss, I need a partner who understands that loyalty isn't bought, it's earned in blood. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, the air between them thick with a new, dangerous electricity. You are no longer a guest of the fortress, and you are certainly not a servant. You are the new guard. My side is the only place you belong.